no good deed. I'm a nurse at a busy hospital, and I've seen my fair share of strange situations. But nothing could have prepared me for the nightmare that started with a routine surgery and ended with my life being turned upside down. It began like any other day. A patient named Doug came in for a fairly simple procedure, nothing too serious. He was polite, a little nervous, but nothing out of the ordinary. As I prepped him for surgery, he kept thanking me over and over, saying how lucky he was to have me as his nurse. I smiled and brushed it off. It's normal for patients to be grateful, especially when they're incredibly nervous right before a surgery. But there was something about Doug's gratitude that felt a little overboard. He would call me amazing and the best nurse ever, all on day one, laying it on a little too thick. I did my job, made sure he was comfortable, and everything went smoothly. The surgery was a success, and I helped him with his recovery in the days that followed. But the compliments just kept coming. It got to the point where I felt uncomfortable. Doug was so insistent on telling me how great I was, almost to the point of being overbearing. He would stop me in the hall to say it, or thank me again after I checked his vitals. I couldn't help but notice that he didn't shower any of the other nurses with nearly as much praise, despite the fact that they were working just as hard as me to take care of him. Just before he was discharged, Doug nervously asked me if I'd like to go out with him sometime. I politely turned him down, explaining that as a nurse, I wasn't allowed to date patients. His smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. He said he understood, thanked me again for everything, and left. I thought that was the end of it, but a few days later, I received a huge bouquet at work. The card simply said, "Thanks for taking such great care of me." I told the other nurses that it was for the whole ward and tried to move on, but the next day, I got a phone call at the front desk. It was Doug. "Did you get the flowers?" he asked, his voice eager. I thanked him and tried to cut the conversation short, but he wasn't finished. More flowers came, and candy, and balloons, and cards. It became nearly a daily occurrence. More phone calls followed. It was starting to feel suffocating. About a month later, as I was leaving the hospital after my shift, I froze. Doug was standing there with a dozen roses in his hand, smiling like he had just won a prize. "I'm not a patient anymore," he said, almost proudly, as he approached me. I tried to decline as politely as possible, but the smile on his face faded, replaced by something darker, something colder. He followed me to my car, begging me to give him a chance, that he just wanted to take me out to show his appreciation. He pleaded with me to let him take me to dinner. "I really can't," I said, a knot in my stomach. I have a boyfriend." His face twisted, and in an instant his hand shot out and grabbed my car door, stopping me from closing it. His eyes locked onto mine with a chilling intensity. "Liar," he growled, his voice low and menacing. He stormed off after that, and I was left shaking in my car. I didn't drive home for almost 15 minutes. I just sat there, trying to calm my racing heart. For weeks after that, I kept looking over my shoulder, never knowing when Doug might pop up again. I started having security walk me to my car at night, but there was no sign of him. One night, about a month later, I worked the overnight shift. It was a quiet night on the ward. Patients asleep, the halls eerily calm, but something didn't feel quite right. It was as if I was being watched. I couldn't explain it. I just felt that someone was there, just out of sight. I'd hear footsteps around the corner, but when I looked, no one was there. Then I saw a shadow in the doorway of a patient's room, but when I came out, the hall was empty. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My pulse quickened. I was sitting at the desk, trying to shake off the creeping sense of dread, when I heard footsteps again. This time, I peeked out and saw the white coat of a doctor entering a room down the hall. I did a double take. There was no patient in that room. I waited for the doctor to come back out, thinking he had just made a mistake, but he stayed in there. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to check. I walked down the hall and peeked into the room. The lights were off. "Doctor?" I called, my voice shaky. "Oh, good," came a voice, but it wasn't a doctor's voice that I recognized. It was deep. Too deep. "Can you give me a hand, nurse?" I flipped the light switch, but the lights didn't come on. My heart pounded as I stepped into the room. Before I could say a word, someone grabbed me from behind, pulling me into a tight embrace. One hand clamped over my mouth, the other around my waist. I gasped, my body fighting, but it was no use. "It didn't have to be this way," Doug hissed in my ear. "I just wanted to take you out. I'm a nice guy, but you couldn't see that. You had to jerk me around." I tried to scream, but the hand over my mouth muffled it. He threw me onto the bed, and in that moment I realized I was fighting for my life. The struggle was chaotic and violent. I fell to the floor, gasping for air, and I saw the call button on the nightstand. With shaking hands, I pounded on it. Doug yanked me by the hair and dragged me across the room, his grip tightening around my neck. I couldn't breathe. The world around me started to blur. Then I heard it, a woman's voice, one of the other nurses, screaming for help. And then footsteps rushing down the hall. 2 security guards burst into the room, pulling Doug off of me. They dragged him out, kicking and struggling. The police arrived a few minutes later, and Doug was arrested. I haven't been back to the hospital since that night. I'm not sure I ever will. Nurses are needed everywhere, so I might try to find a fresh start somewhere else. But I'm not sure if even that will make the fear go away. I treated Doug just like any other patient. Polite, professional, caring. But apparently, that was all it took to trigger this obsession. And now, I'm left wondering how many other patients might be just like him. The old psych ward. I broke my leg while hiking. The fall was sudden, and the pain was unbearable. A compound fracture. I ended up in the hospital for surgery. Little did I know, the real nightmare was just beginning. Once out of surgery and in my room for the night, I tried to settle in, but something felt off. My leg throbbed, and the painkillers made me feel woozy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Around midnight, I started hearing whispers, low, garbled voices, like murmurs in the distance. I couldn't make out the words, but they were unsettling. Every time I blinked, I thought I saw shadows moving across the room, flickering just out of my sight. I pulled the blankets up to my chin, trying to convince myself it was just the anesthesia messing with my head. But the voices, they didn't stop. They seemed to come from all around me, soft but insistent. I thought I saw shapes moving at the edge of the room, just beyond the reach of the dim hospital lights. I couldn't move, couldn't call out. The painkillers kept me paralyzed in place, and the shadows crept closer. When morning came, I told the nurses about the strange sounds, but they just smiled and nodded. "You were probably just dreaming," one of them said. "The meds can do that." I asked if anyone had come into my room during the night, and they assured me that only my assigned nurse had. They checked on me a few times, but I was always asleep, they said. I tried to shrug it off, convinced it was just the drugs playing tricks on me. They wanted me to stay for another couple of nights, so I agreed, though I couldn't shake the unease that settled over me. The second night was worse. I was more awake, but still heavily medicated. The voices grew louder and harsher, but I still couldn't make out the words. And the shadows, they were moving now, crawling across the walls and ceiling, like twisted figures from some nightmare. I pressed the morphine button as much as possible until I finally faded into a restless sleep. By morning, I was terrified. I asked the nurse about the night before, and she gave me the same excuse. It must just be the medication, she said with a practiced smile. But there was something in her eyes, a flicker of hesitation, like she was hiding something. I could tell she wasn't being entirely truthful, but I didn't press it. Instead, I tried to focus on getting better, even though the fear gnawed at me. Later that day, the custodian came in to clean the room. He was a tall man, older than most of the staff, and he moved with a quiet, almost cautious air. As he cleaned around the room, I asked him if he had noticed anything strange. He hesitated, then glanced around as if checking to make sure no one was listening. "You know," he said, lowering his voice, "this wing was just renovated last year. It had been closed for almost 20 years. They reopened it because the hospital was getting overcrowded." I was intrigued, and I asked him why it had been closed. His face darkened. "It used to be the psych ward," he said, glancing nervously at the door. "There were rumors. Bad rumors, you know. People say there was mistreatment, things they don't like to talk about. And then, when they were renovating, there were accidents. Construction workers hurt themselves. Some people said they saw things, too. After it reopened, people started hearing voices in the old rooms. Screams, whispers, but they aren't coming from the patients." My stomach turned. "What do you mean? What kind of voices?" He took a step closer, his voice dropping even lower. "People say they hear them at night, the voices of patients who never left. They say some of them still linger, trapped." He shuddered. "I don't know about all that," he said, "but I don't like being here even in the daylight, and you couldn't pay me enough to come in here after dark." I wanted to ask more, but he stopped himself and hurried out of the room, leaving me with a sickening feeling in my chest. I wished I hadn't asked. That night, everything was worse. The voices came back again, and now, for the first time, I could make out the words. "No. Help. Stop. I want to go home." They were shouting, panicked, pleading. I could hear the desperation in them. And the shadows on the walls, they crawled faster now, moving in every direction, closing in on me. I was awake, my heart racing. The painkillers weren't working as well as before, but I was still too terrified to move. I pressed the call button and waited, and waited, and waited. But the nurse never came. I stayed awake the entire night, paralyzed by fear, convinced that whatever was haunting this place was going to get me too. The nurses never came in, not in response to my call button, not to check on me, not even once. By morning, I was a wreck. I told my husband I wanted to leave, to go home. I hadn't told him about the voices or the shadows because I didn't want to sound crazy. I just told him I couldn't sleep there and I'd do better at home. The doctor said I should stay another night or two, but I put my foot down. I needed to get out. The first night back at home was a blur. I was still hearing the voices, even in my own bed. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every creak of the house made me jump. My husband gave me something to help me sleep, and I managed to get through the night. Things began to calm. By the next night, I could sleep without medication beyond the pain pills they sent me home with. I weaned off of those as my leg healed, and now, a month later, I'm well on my road to recovery. But the memories of those 3 nights in the hospital will haunt me forever. I don't know if the voices were real, or if it was just the drugs messing with my mind. I don't know if that old janitor was telling me the truth, or just trying to freak me out. All I know is I'm never going back there again. Room 216. I work the graveyard shift as an orderly at a hospital in a major city. That's as specific as I'm willing to be for my own safety. Sorry if that seems melodramatic. It's not exactly a glamorous job, but it pays the bills. I'd been working there long enough where I thought I was numb to all the weird and unsettling things that go down. I was wrong. It was just past midnight, and I was in the ER when a new patient was rushed in. He was in bad shape. Multiple gunshot wounds and a car crash on top of that. It seemed like he'd been trying to flee whoever was shooting at him, lost consciousness, and crashed the car. I couldn't help but think, this guy's not going to make it. But they rushed him into surgery, and I went on with my night. About 2 hours later, they called me in to move him into recovery. I did the usual, checking his vitals, getting him hooked up to the machines. The last thing I did before clocking out was take him to his room. He was still unconscious, his breathing shallow, but he was alive. I was exhausted. I grabbed my coat and made my way to the exit. But just as I stepped outside into the crisp early morning air, a white SUV pulled up. The windows rolled down, and I instinctively jumped back. The driver, a thin guy with short blonde hair, gave me a friendly smile. "Hey there," he called out. "We were wondering if you saw a guy come in tonight. The driver glanced at his passenger and then back to me. "He may have been shot." Something felt off about the interaction, and I couldn't give out patient information like that. So I told him he should head into the main desk, give them the patient's name, and they'd be able to help. But the driver shrugged it off. "We really don't want to do that," he said, a little too casually. "See, if we ask all official-like about a shooting, they're going to want to notify the cops, and for various reasons, we'd rather not have that." I was getting nervous. Something wasn't right. I stammered, "Sorry, I really can't help you." The passenger, a bigger guy with dark hair, handed the driver something. The driver extended his hand toward me, tapping the side of his car, eyebrows raised. He had $200 bills in his grasp. "We don't want you to get in trouble," he said, his voice suddenly too smooth. "You don't have to give us official details. We just want to know if our friend is okay." I glanced at the cash. $200. My paycheck covered the bills, but that was pretty much it. That money, it could help a lot. I hesitated, then nodded. He came out of surgery. I took him to his room. He was still unconscious, but he was alive when I left. The driver smiled and extended the cash. I took it without thinking. But then he leaned forward a little, his eyes cold. "You don't happen to remember what room you took him to, do you?" I looked away, my gut twisting. I shouldn't tell them that. But then I saw another crisp $100 bill slip into his hand. The tension in my chest made it hard to breathe. "Room 216, I muttered. He smiled, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. "Thank you, my friend." I reached for the extra 100, but then he snapped his fingers, pulling the money away just before I could grab it. The smile dropped from his face, and his voice turned icy. "We never had this conversation," he said. I froze. Of course not. He smiled again, but there was something hollow about it. "Good answer," he said, handing me the money. The SUV drove off into the night, leaving me standing there, feeling sick to my stomach. The next night, I was back in the ER when chaos broke out. A code silver was announced, and I had to rack my brain for a moment to remember what that meant. Someone with a weapon. Then I heard it from one of the nurses. There were gunshots heard on the second floor. We were short-staffed when it came to security, and a doctor barked at me to secure the nearest exit. Before I could get there, the door to the stairwell burst open, and 2 men in ski masks tore past me, nearly knocking me over. A few moments later, a police officer came sprinting after them, his gun drawn. I followed them all to the door, watching as the 2 masked men jumped into the back of a white SUV, the same one from last night, and peeled away. The cop radioed for backup, but it was too late. They were gone. Later, I found out what happened. The two men had gone into room 216. They finished what had been started the night before. They slit the patient's throat. The officer had been stationed outside the room, but he had taken a quick bathroom break. By the time he came back, the job was done and they were making their escape. The cops weren't sure why the patient had been targeted in the first place, or at least that's what they told us. They had stationed the officer there because they suspected that whoever had shot him the night before wasn't done with him yet. They were right about that. The entire staff on duty was questioned. Standard stuff. Did we see anything unusual? Did anyone seem out of place? I never mentioned my interaction with the men in the white SUV. I don't think the cops suspected that I was involved in any way, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had led the killers right to their victim. It's been a few months now, and I can't stop thinking about that night. Every time I close my eyes, I can see the money in the driver's hand, the cold smile on his face. I carry that guilt like a weight around my neck. I didn't slit his throat, but I might as well have. I've never believed in ghosts, but now, every time I pass by room 216, I can't help but feel like someone's watching me, waiting for a chance at revenge. The Visitor. I work as a nurse in a hospice ward, and I've seen my fair share of things in this line of work. But there's one story that still gives me chills every time I think about it. It involves a man named Alan who came to our unit for a little comfort in the final days before he passed. Alan was in his late 50s, diagnosed with terminal cancer. He had a son and a daughter, both in their mid-20s, who came with him when he was admitted. Alan's son was engaged, and his daughter was married with a young son of her own. His children and their families visited frequently, each time filling his room with love, laughter, and lots of family photos. They decorated the room with balloons, framed pictures, and even a Buffalo Bills helmet, a small homage to their shared tradition of watching football together every Sunday. I was working the day Alan was admitted, and then the following day, but after that I had 3 straight days off. When I came back, it was clear that his time was running out. He spent most of the day sleeping, drifting in and out of consciousness. His kids had gone home for the night, leaving him in peace. I remember noticing how quiet his room was, except for the soft beeping of his monitors. That evening, around 7 p.m., a woman arrived. She was in her late 30s or early 40s, pretty, with dark hair and an air of quiet grace. The moment she stepped into Alan's room, his whole demeanor shifted. His eyes fluttered open, and a small smile spread across his face. He whispered something to her, and they started chatting softly. I don't know if she said anything specific, but Alan was clearly engaged with her. His voice was raspy and weak, but it was the most animated I had seen him since he arrived on our ward. I went about my duties, taking care of my other patients, trying to give them the same comfort I gave him. When visiting hours ended, I pretended not to notice that she was still there. He didn't have much time left, and they weren't bothering anyone. Another hour passed in a blur of routine work, but then, around 9 p.m., a code blue sounded from Alan's room. His vitals had crashed. I rushed to his side, the night shift doctor right behind me. We worked frantically, trying to stabilize him, but it was too late. I turned to ask the woman to step outside, but when I looked around, she was gone. And so was Alan. I helped his children arrive to say their final goodbyes, and after some time, they began to gather his things. That's when one of the photos, tucked away among the personal items, caught my eye. It was a picture of a much younger Alan, smiling beside a woman who looked incredibly familiar. I picked it up and stared, blinking in confusion. Alan looked at least 10 years younger in the photo, but the woman, She hadn't aged a day. It was the same woman who had visited earlier, the one who had seemed to bring him to life again, right at the end. I cleared my throat. "Excuse me," I said, holding up the photo. "Who is this with your dad?" Alan's daughter looked at the photo, smiling. "That's our mom," she said, her voice warm with memories. "They took that photo in Hawaii for their 20th anniversary." Her smile faded slightly, and I could see sadness in her eyes. "Is she—" I hesitated, not sure how to ask. "Is she still—" A tear slipped down her cheek. "She passed away a few weeks after they got back from that trip," she said quietly. "A drunk driver hit her on her way home from work." I stood there, frozen, as her words sank in. "At least they're together now," she added, wiping her tear. A cold shiver ran up my spine. I wanted to tell her about the woman who had visited Alan, the way his face lit up when she walked into the room, how she'd been there when he passed. But the words wouldn't come. I didn't want to sound crazy. I cleared my throat again. I'm sure they are," I said softly. And I was. In fact, I'd never been more sure of anything in my life. As I left the room that night, the image of the woman, unchanged, timeless, stayed with me. I'm not a religious person, but I couldn't help but feel some peace in the thought that Alan had been reunited with the love of his life, waiting for him on the other side. Thanks for listening, friends. If you enjoyed these disturbing and allegedly true hospital horror stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. And we'll see you next time with more whispers from the pines.